quite some time when painting with watercolor, I've mainly used paper towels and my brush to lift watercolor. But then I saw this video that was promoting an art hack using a magic eraser in order to erase both wet and dry watercolor. Also around the same time, I was browsing the Blick site and I saw something called Aqua Lift, which is a specialty sponge for lifting watercolor. So I started to wonder what things around my house would actually, including those two things that I got, lift watercolor the best. So in this video, I'm going to explore all of these different ones. I have my brush, I've got the Aqua Lift, the magic eraser, I've got a normal paper towel, then a shop towel, which is sometimes more absorbent. I have a natural sponge that's kind of for art purposes. I have a household sponge and a rag. This is just a cotton rag. And I want to know what lifts watercolor the best. And I'm going to test this with a few different variables. For each lifting item, I'm going to be putting 2 strips of color down. I've got a pretty non-staining color, the blue, and a pretty staining color, the pink color. And then I'm going to try to lift it using the dry implement. So for my brush here, I'm going to have to really, really dry it off. It's not perfectly dry, but it's pretty dry. And then I'm also going to test having it be a little damp and then trying to lift so that we can see, because there are some differences between the two. As you can see here, in general, using a damp brush does lift the wet watercolor better. And then over in that right quadrant there, we're going to let those dry. So we're going to test all of the wet ones first, so lifting while everything is still wet on all of these different tools or implements to lift watercolor with. Then we'll revisit once everything is nice and dry and do the same thing with a damp whatever it is that we're testing. The paper towel is probably actually my personal favorite, or what I typically reach for, because I find it really practical, easy to use, and it absorbs a ton. You can see even when it is wet, it absorbs a bunch, but it might have a little bit more absorption qualities once it's a little damp. Either that or I just used a larger portion of it, so I would kind of call that one similar. And as to be expected, the one where it's staining, it doesn't remove quite as much as the one where it was a non-staining color. So let's breeze through the rest of these because you've kind of got the idea of what I'm going to be doing here. The shop towel, I had high hopes for. This was actually a suggestion from one of my TikTok videos that I should try this since they're way more absorbent. And I was thinking, absolutely, this is probably going to be the winner of all the winners. And in general, I was kind of disappointed by it. Not that it wouldn't work, but it didn't work as well as just a normal paper towel. Then on to a magic eraser. And technically the person who was testing this was more showing this on dried, so we might want to reserve any judgment for that, but I'm going to test it here while it's wet as well, and it works pretty well. The one thing that I can even see in this already is there's a chance, because this is basically just a micro abrasive, for this to easily start to damage the paper without you really knowing, because it feels nice and smooth. But in general, once it's damp, it works really well. When it is dry, it does not work at all. Well, I mean, it does, but it just more smudges it. Then it's time to take the actual Aqua Lift, or these specialty lifting sponges for watercolor, for a spin, and let's see how they stack up against what we've done so far. Kind of similar to the magic eraser because they have a similar texture. I do think they're made of slightly different things, but they have a very similar texture. And they do have a very similar effect where it does not work very well when it's dry, but it works pretty well when it's wet. Then on to an art sponge. I'm calling it an art sponge because I actually bought it in a pack of natural sponges at an art shop where they had a pack of natural sponges for texture and a bunch of other things. So I thought this would be an interesting one to throw in there. And it works okay. Definitely works a little better damp, and this one is a little bit of a strange texture, so it didn't lift super well, but it still did something. Then on to the house sponge, and this one I've got pretty high hopes for because sponges are super absorbent, and as you can see, it lifts okay, but you get a lot of that texture when it's dry. Now if we make it slightly damp, it works really well, and all you have to do is tap, so it's going to be super easy to pull that up without damaging the paper. And then finally a nice cotton rag, and it didn't do much when it was dry. It definitely does better when it's wet, but I think there were definitely better options as far as what to use when you're trying to lift wet pigment off of paper or freshly wet pigment, but it works pretty good. So that's our first test, but let's reserve our judgment and let's move over to the dried side of the paper and let's see what's going to actually lift this watercolor the best. Now, remember, I can't use a dry tool in order to lift something dry. That would just be sanding the paper off, which is not what we want to do in this test. So I will make each one of these implements damp before I do attempt to lift. I'm going to do my best to lightly lift this off because one thing that's a huge concern with lifting is damaging the paper underneath it, which is going to make it be, well, one, damaged, but it'll have a funny texture. And if you were hoping to layer on top of it, that damaged paper is going to not work how you expect it to, and it's going to cause some unintended side effects. As we move down this, you can see that most of these were able to lift dried watercolor fairly well, but you might even be able to see already a few of these, like with the magic eraser, you can see a little bit of that pilling happening where even though I'm trying to be super light because of that micro abrasive quality of those, it's going to want to just kind of lightly tear up the top layer of that paper. That natural sponge or artist sponge is probably the least good at removing this. And again, I think a different type of natural sponge might be better at this, but I think it would be similar to the house sponge. And the house sponge on this one, we can't just kind of tap, we do have to kind of scrub a little bit. So again, we're at a pretty good risk of, since that's a little more abrasive because it's meant to be used on much harder things, at ruining that top layer of our paper. Let's do a quick recap and review because in general, this test here might just show you that you can use pretty much anything that's at least mildly absorbent to lift watercolor, and that is great news. But what ones am I going to actually reach for when I need to lift watercolor knowing what I know? I do think my two main ones are going to stay the same, the brush and the paper towel, because they performed quite well in the test. They don't really damage the paper, and I already have them on hand, so I don't need to grab extra supplies to actually do this during my watercolor practice. The magic eraser worked pretty well. I may use this again, but I will definitely reach for that aqua lift over the magic eraser because it did not damage the paper as much, and so it would enable me to still be able to layer and things like that on top of the lifted area. So I would say my top three are brush, normal paper towel. I was pretty disappointed by the shop towel. Then maybe I'm recommending those aqua lifts. I feel like it's not necessary to spend the money on it. As you can see, there's a bunch of stuff you might already have, but if you do have some of those or you really like how well this lifts, then maybe it's worth investing, but I wouldn't like run out to the store to get them. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite thing to use to lift watercolor is with, and if it has any downfalls, like does it damage the paper or things like that. I'm curious, are there more things I should test out? If this video was helpful to you, please consider subscribing to my channel, and I hope that you have a magically creative day.